Hello. I'm Lynn Pasquarello, president of Mount Holyoke College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. It is such an honor and privilege to host President Mary Robinson to our campus today. President Robinson, your accomplishments in the political arena, as a human rights advocate, as a champion of women's leadership, teacher, scholar, and author, have resulted in your being one of the clearest and most compelling voices of our time for environmental justice. At Mount Holyoke, our mission is to use liberal learning for purposeful engagement in the world, and we share your deep and abiding commitment to safeguarding the environment for future generations as a basic tenet of global social justice. These ideals are taught both inside and outside of the classroom. And while we have extraordinary faculty to deliver a strong and vibrant curriculum, one of the most critical components of a Mount Holyoke education is the work that we do through community-based learning in partnership with our South Hadley neighbors and the members of the local communities, Holyoke, Chicopee, Springfield, Amherst, and the many other surrounding towns in the Pioneer Valley. We are truly grateful for all that our community partnerships do to enrich the lives of our faculty, students, staff, and alumni. Today's event would not have been possible without the support of the Odyssey Bookshop, the Irish Cultural Center at Elms College, the Ancient Order of the Hibernians of Holyoke, the Holyoke and South Hadley Chambers of Commerce, and the Holyoke St. Patrick's Day Parades Committee. I also want to thank several individuals from my own campus who have given directly of their time and expertise in organizing this event. Kevin McCaffrey, my Director of Government and Community Relations, the staff of the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives, the Miller-Worley Center for the Environment, the Weissman Center for Leadership in the Liberal Arts, and the 5 College Women's Studies Research Center. It is also a distinct pleasure to have our Congressman and trustee, Richard Neal, with us today to help introduce President Robinson. We could not ask for a better friend of the college, of higher education in general, of the nation, and indeed the country of Ireland. Finally, I'm especially appreciative of the leadership of Eva Paus, Professor of Economics, and Carol Hoffman Collins, Director of the McCulloch Center for Global Initiatives in organizing this event. Eva inspires students to take up the challenge to excel, not only by helping students understand that we live in a world that is increasingly globally interdependent, but also by providing them with the tools necessary to be change makers. It's my pleasure to now turn this program over to Professor Eva Paus.
Good afternoon. It's truly wonderful to see how so many of you out here on a beautiful, sunny first spring day. It tells us how much we all want to hear Mary Robinson speak this afternoon. I would like to, as so many times for events like this, there are few people who do most of the heavy lifting, so I would like to thank them before we proceed, and that's Jenny Medina in the McCulloch Center, Janet Lansbury, and Pat Sigliano of the Weissman Center for Leadership, Irasima and Perul and Yolanda Aponte and Kevin McCaffrey in the President's office. And really, first and foremost, last and foremost, Joan Grenier, who is the owner of the Odyssey Bookshop. I think it's highly unlikely we would be here this afternoon, actually completely unlikely. We would be here this afternoon without Joan and the independent bookstore across the street. The reason is that Mary Robinson, President Robinson, has written an autobiography Everybody Matters, and that autobiography has taken her on the road. It actually just came out this week in this country, so you'll be some of the first to read it, and that has taken President Robinson on a book tour. If the book is available in the back of the auditorium, and after President Robinson's talk and some Q&A, she is willing to sign books up here in the front. So I hope. I actually spent one sleepless night reading the book from cover to cover. I highly recommend it. I would like now to turn it over to Congressman Richard Neal, who will introduce President Robinson. There is a lot that I could and should say about Congressman Neal, but for the sake of time, I will make the introduction very short. He has been a fantastic representative of our district, the 2nd district, now the 1st district, for 25 years. He has a very special relationship with Holyoke College. He is a member of our Board of Trustees, and he has a much more special and much longer-lasting relationship with Ireland. He has worked tirelessly for the last 30 years, 3 decades, to contribute to bring peace and justice and reconciliation to the Green Isle. So without any further ado, please welcome Congressman Neal.
Thank you very much, Eva, for those nice words of introduction, and thanks to President Pasquarella and the Mount Holyoke family for the kind invitation that they've extended to me today to be with you on this momentous occasion. This is one of the premier educational addresses in all of the world. And time and again, I think that this college has not only helped to light the lamp of learning for women, but because it has always been willing to take on the popular and the unpopular causes of the day. Some years ago, I had a chance to be welcomed to, I'm going to struggle with this word, but she's the only one in the audience that will know, Aras Tutoran, the president's, okay, you can tell she's a professor. And she welcomed us in a very gracious manner. And one of the things I want to point out that I thought, in my memory, was so important that day, she had put a candle in the window of the president's home, signifying that in the great Irish diaspora, that all and at any time were welcomed home. How powerful the symbolism of her leadership, largely because she was willing, during her tenure as president, to take on causes that were popular and unpopular, whether or not it was a human rights struggle in Beijing, Bosnia, or Belfast. She was in the vanguard, always consistent with the American belief, incidentally, that our First Amendment guarantees a second opinion. She received a Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama, and I thought it was noteworthy and indeed ironic this morning as I was thumbing through the Boston Globe that yesterday a commander of our naval fleet in the Pacific was asked, what is the great national security threat? And you would have thought he would have said the aggressive posture of the Chinese. He might have mentioned Korea. You would have thought that he would have mentioned new naval challenges. And he said, oh, of course, it's global warming. And I thought that that was noteworthy as well. The people in this audience, Madam President, they have given me a chance over 30 years to participate in the north of Ireland in all of these it will never happen moments. Well, it did happen. And it's become the model for the world in terms of conflict resolution. President Robinson was willing to give of her popularity at that time by visiting Belfast when it was almost forbidden for an official in the Republic of Ireland to venture north. But it was that risk-taking that has helped bring us to this day. She has been a stalwart on behalf of human rights everywhere. And I was trying to think of a good example today of an individual who had taken up a very similar but unpopular cause in America. And the thought occurred to me, always remember that it was President Adams who defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, because his argument was they are entitled to a defense even if they don't think we're entitled to a defense. A fascinating moment in American history. You wouldn't be surprised to note that she's from County Mayo. And Madam President, that's where half the city of Holyoke once came from. And many of them, as you know, were native Irish speakers. We're just past 150 years from the Great Famine, War, which changed the nature of Ireland and America forever. 1 million perished and 1 million immigrated, mostly to America. It changed the entire complexion of the United States. But I think for anybody who has traveled the globe, one of the things you're struck with, no matter where you travel, there's that Irish missionary, that individual who has taken up the cause of human rights, has taken up the cause of poverty, has stood with the lepers against popular will. And I think that Mary Robinson's career has been consistent with all of those endeavors. It's an honor for me to introduce to you today President Mary Robinson. How are you?
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. I'm going to make a presentation to you briefly.
Okay.
Pretty good. As we get ready for Patrick's Day in but a week, the Springfield newspaper, the Springfield Republican, has published a remarkable book about the Irish legacy here in Western Massachusetts. And Madam President, I'd like to present it to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Congressman Richard Neal. It's very good for me to hear a congressman with such strong Irish roots and such a pride in those roots being very much celebrated here in Mount Holyoke, because the Irish have always placed a great importance on education. And I think it's right to reinforce the importance of the quality of education and what it can do, and particularly in this instance, what it can do for young women. Madam President, I love saying that, Madam President Pascala. I was very, very impressed with the students that I had an opportunity to interact with before coming into this hall, and you can be proud of the spirit and the openness and the knowledge and the confidence of those young women. They will go far and they will make a difference, and I think that's what Mount Holyoke is all about. When I was invited to come here, I thought I might share my passion with you. I wasn't quite aware that it was going to be this broader audience, and in fact, I really thank the Irish support groups, and I know there are quite a lot of people from Ireland here. I will touch on Ireland from time to time, and certainly in the question and answer, please feel free to raise questions. But I thought I might talk about, first of all, my interest in human rights, and then how that brought me to climate change and now to climate justice. The human rights part started very early. You see, growing up in the west of Ireland, in County Mayo, I was the only girl with 4 brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger than me. So of course I became interested in human rights and equality and my elbows and asserting myself. And I was very fortunate that my parents, both doctors, very much impressed on me that I had the same opportunities, that I had the same possibilities as my 4 brothers, even though the ambiance generally in Ireland at that time was very different. When I was growing up, girls knew their place. The place of the woman was in the home. Girls really basically should either prepare for marriage or become nuns. Indeed, I even offered to be a nun because I thought that gave me more options, but fortunately the Reverend Mother had the good sense to say I should go away for a year. And my parents were delighted I was going to become a nun because they were very devout Catholics, but also glad to have me for another year. So they sent me to Paris, and that changed everything. I was fortunate enough not just to study law, but to come to law with my grandfather's words in my ear, that law was a wonderful way of bringing about social change, an instrument for social change. So from the very beginning, I wanted to study law to make change, to make life fairer, to bring about more equality, to take on some issues. And the issues that I wanted to take on in the context of Ireland tended to be the way in which the law at the time, because it was very dominated, if you like, by the fact that most of the people in the Republic of Ireland were Catholics, the church had a huge influence, and there was a tendency to equate sin and criminal law. And I felt that there was a need to think about that and also create more space, particularly in the area of family planning legislation, of removing the ban on divorce, which was in the Irish Constitution, and so on. And these were the things that I actually spoke about as a student in Trinity College as auditor of the Law Society. And then, having graduated in law from Trinity, I came to the United States, to the Harvard Law School. I was very lucky to get a fellowship to Harvard, and I was extremely lucky in the year that I was there. I really pay tribute always to the fact that that was a year that had a huge influence on my life, because I'm the class of 1968. Now, I know that's ancient for some of the students in the audience, absolutely ancient, but it was an incredible year. When I arrived, I found that my contemporaries were questioning an immoral war, the war in Vietnam, immoral as they saw it. Law was being taught in a much more exciting way, the Socratic method, questioning and changing the questions so you had to think. And most of the students were talking about civil rights in the south of this country, possibly going into poverty programs also in the southern part of the country. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April, and we were devastated by that. And then just after I graduated, Robert Kennedy was killed. And all of this had a huge impact on me, in particular because I was surrounded by young people who were saying they were going to make a difference. And that was very surprising to me, because in Ireland at that time, young people, whether boys or girls, young men or young women, knew their place. You didn't interrupt your elders, your adults, and you waited, and then maybe your turn would come. And I was really very affected by the fact that young people were saying, no, we've got to get out there and make a difference. We've got to change things because we're not happy that they're fair or just. And I came back to Ireland with some additional confidence. At that time, Nick and I hadn't married, but we were law students together and we had graduated together, and then he became a political cartoonist. And when I was describing how I wanted to change things, he did say that I was full of Harvard humility. Anyway, that Harvard humility encouraged me to go forward for the parliamentary elections to the Irish Senate, which followed the elections to the lower house, the Dáil. And in the Senate, you had 6 university seats for the 2 university streams, one of them being Trinity College. And I queried why it was always elderly male professors who got elected. So my friends said, well, look, if you feel like that, we'll support you, let's see. And so I went forward, and at the age of 25 got elected to the Senate, which meant that I could take part in contributing to legislation. And the first legislation that I contributed to became very controversial because it was a law to regulate family planning. And maybe we can come back to that. But I want to move on to the opportunity that I had to teach law, which I did for almost 20 years in Trinity College, and I loved teaching. I've always loved being with students, young people. I feel very encouraged when I'm discussing with young people. Practicing law as a barrister and taking cases in the Irish courts that would make a difference, often not just for the individual, but actually for a whole lot of others, what you would call in this country class actions. And some of them were on issues of equal pay, they were on issues of removing discrimination in the law. And because Ireland had ratified the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, it was possible to go beyond the Irish courts and go to Strasbourg, or if there was no remedy in Ireland, go direct to Strasbourg and try and get a remedy there. The most famous case that I took, because my client was such an extraordinary woman, it was a case for a woman called Josie Airy. She was a very poor woman who had a stall on the street in County Cork, and she claimed that her husband was abusing her, he was beating her, and he did get convicted in the district court for abusing her and was fined a small fine. And apparently the problem continued, and she sought a judicial separation. There was no divorce in Ireland at the time, but she sought a judicial separation, and in order to get that, she would have to go into the High Court, and so she went to various lawyers in Cork, and nobody would take her case, because she didn't have any money to pay, and they didn't want to have the expense of taking the case in those circumstances. And Josie Airy read in a newspaper that there was a body called the Commission on Human Rights in Strasbourg. And this woman, who wasn't literate, who just had a strong sense of justice, wrote a long, rather rambly letter, misspellings, etc., to the Commission of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And there were two good lawyers in the commission who understood that although there was a lot of irrelevant stuff in her letter, there was a kernel of something that needed to be addressed. She was saying that she couldn't get a judicial separation. Therefore, she couldn't get access to justice to protect her family life. Two things that were very key in Strasbourg. So money was provided by Strasbourg, legal aid, to a solicitor in Ireland to instruct a barrister, which is where I came in, to take the case for Mrs. Airy, that she was denied legal aid in Ireland to get justice for her family life. And it was an incredible excitement as a young lawyer to argue that case first before the Commission of Human Rights with my client Josie Airy there, and then the Commission accepted that we had merit in our case and joined with us in taking the case before the Court of Human Rights, and we were successful, and it was very much written up as a breakthrough. But most of all, there was a real sense that not only did it help Mrs. Josie Airy, but it meant that the Irish government had to introduce civil legal aid, legislation for civil legal aid, and that other European countries were bound by that standard too, because it was the judgment of a court in Strasbourg. And similarly, when Ireland joined the European Union in 1973, there were directives on equal pay and equal opportunity, and Irish law wasn't in full conformity. So it was possible to bring a case in the Irish court and get a reference to the court in Luxembourg, and then go out to Luxembourg and argue the case. And the court in Luxembourg, in each case, found that the argument was sound and advised that the client would win back in Ireland. And this was all very exciting and very much a way of pursuing human rights and justice. And I was then, as you know, elected to serve as President of Ireland in 1990 and served for 7 years until 1997. And the presidency in Ireland is a non-executive presidency. It's not the same as the political presidency in the United States or in France or in most African countries and elsewhere. The main political power is with the Taoiseach and government, and it's a parliamentary system. And I was very pleased on behalf of the people of Ireland to be able to be a voice for human rights internationally by being the first head of state, for example, to go to Somalia and going to Rwanda after the genocidal killing. In fact, I made 3 visits to Rwanda as President of Ireland. The first time, and Nick was with me, we will never forget, the terrible aftermath of a genocidal killing is something that stays with you and it affects you. And for that reason, the following year, when I was invited to represent Ireland at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations in New York, I wanted to go back to Rwanda to somehow bring it to the table just by having gone back and then speak about it in the United Nations in New York. So we went back in 1995 and saw how Rwanda was trying to cope with a huge prison population, a destroyed university, and so on. And I talked about that when I went back to when I went to the UN and represented Ireland at that very high ceremonial occasion when people were talking very rhetorical words about human rights, etc. And I wanted that reality to be reflected on. And the third visit that I made to Rwanda as President of Ireland was in March 1997, a few months before my term ended, and I didn't seek a second term. And what I was doing was I was accepting an invitation to attend a Pan-African women's conference. The women, many of them widows of Rwanda, had got the strength of character and the spirit to organize a Pan-African women's conference with women coming from different African countries, vice presidents, ministers. There was no president woman at that time. There are two now, as you may know, in Liberia and Malawi, but there was none at that time. But most of the senior women came in solidarity with the women in Rwanda. And I even remember when I came back to the airport and there were reporters there, this was back in Dublin after this conference, and I said, "I have seen the future of Africa and she works." And it was kind of a play on the fact that actually most of the work in Africa is done by women, whether it's farming or whatever it is, but also these women were taking political responsibility. And it's in part why Rwanda has made remarkable progress, because they have in fact empowered and involved women in decision-making at all levels. When I decided not to take a second term, I wasn't quite sure what my life would bring, and then the first UN High Commissioner for Human Rights resigned suddenly and went back to his native Ecuador to be foreign minister. It was rumoured at the time, and I think there was some truth in it, that the job was so difficult that he couldn't wait to get back home. Anyway, I asked the Irish government to put me forward to serve as High Commissioner, and the government strongly supported, once they had said to me, "Look, you know, the office is new, it's underfunded, the morale isn't really very good. Do you really want this?" And I said, "Yes, I really want to give leadership on human rights in the UN." And so I was put forward, and Kofi Annan appointed me. And it was very difficult, and I describe in the book the challenges of trying to give leadership and be effective when you have a very small, demoralized, badly managed office that you have to try and sort out. And in fact, it took its toll, as I describe in the book. In my first Christmas when I returned to Ireland, I was absolutely exhausted, and my health was becoming damaged because I was taking sleeping pills and not sleeping properly. And it was only a brother of mine, my oldest brother, who was a doctor, who kind of said to me, "You know, you're in danger of, you know, getting into breakdown territory if you're not careful." And that brother speaking to me like that, you know, was enough to have me throw away the sleeping pills and decide that I would balance my life better and get back on an even keel and continue to work as High Commissioner. And one of the things that I tried to do was to be close to where victims of violations were, because that was a way of getting their voice out. So going to Chechnya, where the Russian government was causing terrible violations of rights. The Chechen fighters were also responsible for violations, but it was the government that I was concerned about, because that was my mandate, to hold governments responsible if they, in uniform or even not in uniform, violated human rights. And in fact, when I came back and reported to the Commission on Human Rights in Geneva, for the first time ever, a resolution was passed against one of the permanent 5 countries, against the Russian Federation, which didn't please them very much. I also went to places like East Timor, when there was terrible conflict there, to Sierra Leone, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Colombia, always with the idea of bringing back the messages. And that led me to think more about the other side of human rights, because I could see that as well. That yes, I was supporting right to life, freedom from torture, the freedom of expression, freedom of the press, all of these important parts of human rights. But what about the other side? Rights to food and safe water and health and education. So when I finished my 5 years as High Commissioner for Human Rights, I decided to focus on those rights and on African countries, on supporting their capacity to strengthen their protection of what we call economic and social rights. And I based myself in New York with a few colleagues. We also had colleagues in the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., and some colleagues in Geneva. And we worked with a lot of partners in different African countries, working on right to health in some countries, working on decent work in other countries, working in a lot of countries, overlapping with those on peace and security issues and women's empowerment, women, peace and security. And that meant I was going, during the 8 years, to a lot of different African countries for reasons of advancing those agendas. And about 3 years into that 8 years, maybe 4 years, I began to hear a different voice, a different sentence, a sentence that began, but things are so much worse. But it's almost impossible now. We don't have any seasons anymore. We have long periods of drought and then flash flooding. In countries like Liberia that had predictable rainy seasons, the rain wasn't coming when it should. Farmers didn't know when to sow, they didn't know when to harvest, the harvest was destroyed. It was so much harder to provide food. And I heard that, and I've heard that constantly since then. And it's something that I wasn't at all conscious of or prepared for. In fact, I saw it in particular in July 2011 in relation to Somalia. I had gone as President of Ireland to Somalia in 1992 to bring attention to the fact that there was fighting between warlords that was preventing food getting to feeding stations. And I remember the terrible scenes, and in fact, I even got very emotional at a press conference describing that, and then went to the United Nations, where Boutros Boutros-Ghali was the Secretary General at the time, and drew attention to Somalia. And he has always thanked me since that for the fact that, as a head of state of a European country, I had drawn attention to a small, forgotten country like Somalia. Well, in 2011, as some of you will remember, there was a terrible food problem because of drought in the Horn of Africa, and in particular in Somalia. And the same Irish aid agencies, Concern and Goal and Oxfam Ireland and Trócaire, asked me if I would go back to Somalia. And when we were there in July 2011, the United Nations declared famine, which is a very, very strict thing. It declared famine in 2 areas of Somalia. And we were told that already at least 28,000 babies, children had died of hunger in that short time, in just a month and a half. And it was just that terrible kind of sense again. But one of the things that had never occurred to me 19 years earlier, in 1992, was absolutely in the front of my mind in July 2011, that the Horn of Africa had had the 8 hottest years ever recorded in succession. And therefore, the drought was getting worse, the impacts were much more tangible, and that this was what we mean by global warming. This is what it's about. And more I realized that we weren't talking about climate change the way we should be. When we say the words climate change, people think of melting glaciers in the distance or a polar bear on an ice flow. And I have nothing against polar bears, but or even the science of staying below 2 degrees Celsius, and it's very complicated, and then it's disputed, particularly in this country. And unfortunately, there are rich lobbies that promote bad science to complicate things and make it seem as though it's not so sure that human intervention using coal and gas is in fact causing the carbon emissions and warming the world. I think it's now becoming more obvious, and this country has suffered from extreme weather, the storm Sandy and the drought in Midwestern states, and these are making people think. But in the poorest countries, people know that climate has changed. They absolutely know it. They know that it's having very adverse effects. It's undermining their human rights to food and safe water, health, education, and even shelter, because many of them have to move from where they have been. And as my friend Constance O'Kellett of northern Kenya describes it, she is a mother of 8. She was growing up in her village, and she says in this lovely, gentle voice, she says, and we were poor, but we had enough to eat. And we were a happy, very Christian village. And then each year it got worse. Droughts for long periods, and then flash flooding. It destroyed our school. And we thought that God was punishing us. And then she formed a women's group and became a local leader in her community, trying to cope with this terribly difficult situation. And she learned about Oxfam, and Oxfam brought her to a conference. And she learned, as she says, that it wasn't God that was punishing us. It was the lives of rich people that were contributing to these fossil fuel. And it's very interesting that she didn't have that perception. I think now more and more communities in poor countries know more and more about what is hurting them and what is affecting, and that it is very much an issue that has to be addressed. So from a human rights perspective, doing human rights work in African countries, I came to the climate issue and realized that it is an enormous human rights issue. In fact, as I looked at it, I became convinced that it is the biggest human rights and security issue. I do agree with the military person who was quoted earlier, by Congressman Neal, that climate change is also probably the biggest security issue that the world faces. But it's not all a doom and gloom issue. It's actually an issue that we can all do something about. And when we were talking earlier with the students, I reminded them of wonderful advice that a great African woman who got the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in Kenya, particularly in linking environment and human rights, doing huge tree planting and trying to reverse some of the trends of drought that were being caused, and speaking out on environment and peace issues. Wangari Maathai was a fantastic woman with a brilliant smile and a great personality, and she was a very inspiring friend. And she would speak in an audience. She would say, you know, I'm talking in more general terms. You might think this is far from you, but there's something every single one of you can do. 3 things every one of you can do: reuse, reduce, recycle. And I think many of us are doing that more and more, but it was an example of the fact that we all need to engage. And one of the things that my foundation is now doing, I've established a foundation in Ireland called the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice. And one of the things that we're doing is we're urging that we change the lives of very poor people in coping with climate by providing them with clean energy. And the numbers we're talking about are really very startling in the 21st century. Even when I say those numbers each time, I kind of think to myself, this is the 21st century. How can it be that 1.3 billion people out of 7 billion have no electricity, no switch they can turn on? In fact, they have light through kerosene, which is very dangerous, or candles, which are also dangerous, and they're expensive to small incomes. They pay too much, but they don't know and they don't have access to the clean cooks, to the lights in the home that are now available. And an even worse statistic in terms of the numbers is that of our world of 7 billion people, 2.6 billion, about 40%, cook on open fires with coal or firewood or animal dung and ingest fumes. And we now know from a recent report in the Lancet medical journal that about 4 million die every year. And of course, they're mainly women, or indeed children beside their mothers, as they're cooking on the open fires and ingest the fumes. And yet we have now clean cook stoves, and we could make a real effort to ensure that those in communities would get light in the home that was clean solar or even small hydro or other light, using biomass, various ways of doing it, and clean cook stoves. And of course, the main thing is that also frees up the time of women. They don't have to go so far. They don't have to risk being raped or attacked as they go, as is often the experience of women, as many of you will know. So that's one real possibility. But most of all, I think we need to just change the way we think about climate change. We need to make it a human story. We need to have various constituencies that get engaged in this. Women, for example, young people, the business community, those who work in voluntary capacities in their community. In other words, pretty well everyone can somehow recognize that this is an issue that is so important that we need to change our behavior. And the change in behavior starts in a family, in a school, in a college, in a community, in a town, in a city, in a region, in a country, and then internationally. It kind of works up. And why do we need to do this? I think many of you know that the governments of the world decided, actually in Mexico in Durban in 2010, that in 2011, that we needed to stay below 2 degrees warming, 2 degrees Celsius warming over pre-industrial standards. And every government has agreed that that is necessary for a safe world. But the projections that we're seeing, and these projections are coming from all the authoritative sources, is that we're not on course to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. Now the governments of the world have agreed that we need a climate agreement, which of course would have as part of it that we need to stay below a 2 degrees world, and how we might do that in a fair way that enabled poor communities to develop. These are very tough issues to address, but very necessary. And I've participated in these climate conferences. I was in Copenhagen, and actually in Copenhagen there was a lot of public interest, and 150,000 people marched in the street for climate justice, for a fair, ambitious climate agreement. It didn't happen there, and somehow the skeptics became more prominent, the media lost interest because we hadn't succeeded, and then we went on to Mexico for the next conference, and it made some modest progress, but it wasn't very noticeable in the media. And then we went on to South Africa, where there was this commitment to stay below 2 degrees Celsius and hopefully have a climate agreement. And then the last conference was in Doha, in Qatar. And as I looked around, it occurred to me that there was no real pressure on the ministers that came from rich countries, or the Todd Stern, who came from the United States representing the country. There was no real pressure from public opinion in the United States that he should get urgent about ensuring that we would have a climate agreement. The urgency was all on the side of the poor countries. They're desperate for an agreement. The small island states that are going to go under, the indigenous peoples whose livelihoods and habitats have been affected. I have a friend, Ursula Rakova, and she's in a small cataract island. She's moving her people, 1,500 people, to Papua New Guinea, to Bougainville. And she describes what she's doing. She's negotiating with the people who live in Bougainville for land and for relationships that they can come and live there. And then she says, with great sadness, and it's the sadness of an indigenous woman, she says, but there's nothing I can do about the fact that we have to leave the land of the bones of our ancestors. And there will be a lot of people who will have to leave the land of the bones of their ancestors. And there'll be a lot of people in low-lying states who'll have to leave cities and leave parts of their countries, leave them because of drought or leave them because of flooding. And so I'll end by sort of reflecting, when you link human rights and climate change, and you call it climate justice, we're actually talking about two sorts of justice, and neither of them is easy. One is the justice to the poorest countries and poorest communities in the world who are being affected in their poor livelihoods. They're actually struggling more now to have food on the table because of climate shocks that are being caused by this global warming that we're all contributing to through our consumer habits and the use of coal and oil and gas, etc. And the other justice is intergenerational. We have to think about our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And we know that unless we take very urgent action now, things will be much, much worse for them as we work not to a world of 7 billion, but by 2050 to a world of 9 billion. And how do I think about that personally? How does it, how do I sort of reflect on it? I reflect on it as an Irish grandmother. I'm very happy that I have 4 grandchildren, 2 in Dublin and 2 in Barcelona. And I think a lot about those grandchildren. I'll be with them at Easter in the west of Ireland. And it's the greatest joy to be with them. And I think to myself, the eldest of my 4 grandchildren is now 9. Therefore, those grandchildren will be in their 40s in 2050. And they will share the world with 9 billion people. And what kind of world will it be? What kind of weather shocks will this world have? And how will it cope? And what will they say about us? I hope they will say, thank goodness they started to get urgent about climate change. But maybe they'll say, how could they have been so selfish? How could they have been so uncaring? Didn't they know how much worse it would be for us if they didn't take steps now? It's an interesting idea. It's an interesting concept of having to think about justice and fairness, not only within a world that we're all living in at the moment, but for our grandchildren and their grandchildren, that they themselves may have a future. So I really was very happy with the discussion earlier with those who are studying here in Holyoke, the girls that I met, because I have every confidence. I may be getting on, and I'm an elder now, and but they're going to solve this, and it's because of the teaching here in Holyoke, and I'm delighted. And thank you very much for seeing a great audience. I'm very happy now to answer any questions. Thank you very much. Apparently there's a microphone there, is that right? Yes. Oh, there's another one here. Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. And is it true that the first person to ask the question gets a particular bonus in the examination? Is that what I heard? Okay. Should we start on this side? Sure. Okay.
Hi, I'm Isabel Arthen, and I'm a student organizer with the Mount Holyoke Divestment from Fossil Fuels campaign. You spoke at length today about the reality that poor communities and marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. However, most of those people who are most directly affected are not in this room today and do not have the access to people with decision-making power. What is our role as privileged students in giving their struggles a voice and making effective change?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Thank you very much. That's something I've given quite a bit of thought to, even in our own work in my foundation. So maybe the example can be somehow helpful. As I mentioned, when you undermine poor livelihoods, there's a big gender dimension. It falls more on women than on men. Women have to have food on the table, they've got to get the firewood, they've got to get the water. So if things are harder, it's harder for them. And so what we've done in my foundation is we've persuaded women who have chaired the conferences of climate and women ministers for environment and energy to come together. And we call it the Troika Plus of women leaders on climate change. And they commit to listening to women who are excluded from the negotiations, but who live in places that are deeply affected. So we have networks of women's groups, Waste Pickers International, all these groups that are affected, indigenous peoples, and we ask the Troika Plus of women leaders not only to engage and to listen, but to bring their ideas into the discussion room and to change the way in which we discuss about climate. And briefly, we actually had a great success through the Troika of women leaders in the last climate conference in Doha last December. We got gender balance into a new decision on gender balance into the conference, meaning that in all the bodies now of climate, like the Green Climate Fund, Technical Committee, the bodies of the UN, FCCC, and also in the delegations that governments send, they commit to having gender balance, which ultimately is 50-50. You have to work towards good, full gender balance. And that is the first time that gender has been on the agenda. It's now going to be on the agenda in future conferences. And it was called the Doha Miracle. It sort of was a great breakthrough for women precisely because they were well organized. So you're organizing, and I think you'll find a way of connecting with and helping to get the voice of those who need their voices to be heard, to get those voices out. So I loved your question. Now, where are you over here? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
While you were speaking, I couldn't help but think that militarism is perhaps mainly at the root of our problems in the sense of waste, destruction, the amount of energy used to destroy, to make weapons that we don't use, and then to have to rebuild afterwards, going into countries for their national resources, killing people by the thousands and millions that we don't see on TV, and our media being controlled by corporations who benefit from this. So it almost seemed like what you're doing, though beautiful, is in face of the larger elephant in the room that we're not mentioning, which is war. And the people in the United States don't step up to speak because we're afraid, because terrorism and internal terrorism and lies and manipulation of the media makes us afraid. So we aren't really looking at what we need to do.
Certainly I agree with you that that is a huge issue that does need to be addressed, and far more urgently and seriously. I was honorary president of Oxfam for 10 years until the end of last year, and Oxfam and Amnesty have been combining to get an arms trade treaty, and even that the UN has not yet been able to agree, but that's something that everybody can join in addressing. The elders are very concerned about the nuclear issue, and we were in North Korea on a visit and are trying to be engaged. So there are so many different ways to approach that issue, but I do agree. And certainly the emissions from military vehicles contribute hugely to global warming, apart from being destructive, are very often destructive in themselves. Other side? Yep.
Hello, my name is Anika Ahrens. I'm a senior here. Thank you for your talk. My question is related to how there's increasing private corporation control and influence in both fossil fuel usage and cases such as mining in Guatemala, human rights issues, and how you're involved in politics, and how do we address these issues from a political arena when these corporations have different ways of operating.
In fact, it's very interesting that there's been a big development for human rights in the area of corporate responsibility for human rights. And that was something that I was concerned about when I served as High Commissioner for Human Rights, but we didn't have a framework to address it. And thanks to work of Professor John Ruggie in Harvard, who was the special representative of the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, and his team, and I supported him a lot with my own colleagues in his work, he was asked to look at what is the appropriate responsibility of corporations in relation to human rights and treatment of people. And he came up with a framework which the Human Rights Council of the United Nations accepted about nearly 4 years ago now. And the framework is 3 words: protect, respect, remedy. And it was accepted by the Human Rights Council that all governments have a responsibility to protect people from violations by corporations of their human rights. So whether it's mining companies or indigenous peoples or driving people off land who don't have proper title, all of that now, there's a clear government responsibility, and that'll have to work its way through and be implemented fully. But secondly, that all corporations have a responsibility to respect all human rights. Now, the word respect is less than protect. So the government have a higher responsibility to protect, but corporations must respect. And Professor John Ruggie was asked to produce guidelines to flesh out what was meant by that. And he's made it clear it's not just a do no harm, I don't need to know about it. It's a due diligence requirement. And again, this will take time to fully take effect, but it will affect the reputation of corporations if they don't respect human rights in the future. If civil society, students and others, hold them to that account and know about these UN guiding principles. And then the third word, remedy, was a recognition we don't have enough good remedies. So I agree that there are problems, but also that corporations are under a new scrutiny. And the OECD is taking this on board, and other standard-setting bodies for corporations are taking it on board. And investors are looking more now to the quality of corporations. So maybe the tide is changing a little bit on that one. Please.
Thank you, Madam President. My name is Margaret Putnam Delaney, and I'm a student interested in classical archaeology and international law here at Mount Holyoke College.
And you've got a good Irish name, too.
I was wondering, as a human rights expert, if you thought that cultural heritage, and specifically the antiquities that we discover through the process, archaeological excavations, constituted a human rights issue. Thank you.
Certainly, there is, protection under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for cultural heritage, and UNESCO in Paris was basically, in a way, set up to protect international heritage. So I'm not quite sure of the antiquities that you were particularly referencing, but have a look at the mandate of UNESCO and the declarations that UNESCO's had, and I think that would certainly be a starting point on looking at that issue. Okay. Yep.
Hello, Madam President. My name is Nani Sihama. I'm a junior here. I'm an economics major and a global business minor. Thank you for taking time to be here with us today to talk with us about climate justice. My question relates to low-income countries. In your address, you did mention that most of the countries affected by climate change are low-income and poor countries. And from what I study in class and through my readings, I have learned that these countries are being advised to industrialize as a way of alleviating poverty. So what advice do you have, and what are the options for countries that don't, at this point in time, don't have the policy space to take a serious industrialization because they don't have access to clean energy, and most of their energy sources are coal and oil. So what do these countries do when they're being advised to go along an economic path that isn't currently viable in this world today?
It's obviously a very important and broad question, and so I can't really give a full answer. But let me say, first of all, that what concerns me is even more basic than that. It is that very poor countries are finding it much harder to have food and nutrition for men, women, and children. So it's undermining food production, never mind getting into industrial policy. And I saw that in Malawi. I was there in January, and what struck me also about Malawi was that it's a country that has basically got most of its population working in agriculture. And it's got two sets of problems in the country: drought in one part and severe flooding in another. And they've both got worse, so it's more difficult. But also, and this is something I didn't touch on earlier, so maybe this is the opportunity to touch on it, I kind of identified with the population of Malawi in the 1960s, because it was the same as the population of the Republic of Ireland, about 3 million people. We've gone up now in the Republic, excluding Northern Ireland, we've gone up to about 4.6, 4.7 million. The population of Malawi at the moment is about 15 million plus. They're not quite sure how much plus. It will be 50 million in 2050 and 120 million at the end of the century. And these are the figures that the World Bank and the United Nations predict, because the family size is 5.7. There are not secondary schools for girls, by and large. So girls get married very young. They have a huge early marriage problem, or get pregnant very young. And when I use that example, usually somebody comes up with the next question: well, what are we going to do about population control? And I say, that's actually the wrong question. It's an important issue, but you've framed it in a way that we must never fall back on. It was a very bad experience in the middle of the last century in relation to countries like India, thinking about issues of population control, meaning somehow control from the outside or control. We actually know exactly how to encourage countries to have a more balanced population, and that is by educating girls and women and by having health systems that make sure that mothers and babies survive. And so, I suppose the last piece of your question, because it's a really relevant question to the issue of climate change, one of the most important rights is a right to development. And if the only way a very poor country can develop is through fossil fuel development, using the oil or gas in that country, then that's the way they will develop and should develop. And we should say they have a right to development. But is that in the interests of other countries that have a technology that they could transfer? The clean technology. Because we're all in this world together. And if the middle classes in the large emerging economies, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, the South Africas, all start using fossil fuel and live the lifestyles we live in, there is no way that we can stay below 2 degrees Celsius. There is no way we can have a safe world. So it's not so much saying they can't develop, it's how they will develop. So what we feel very much in my foundation, and we're talking a lot about this, is we need to think about the way in which we bring about fairness in cutting emissions. And those who have benefited from fossil fuel growth and have access to clean technologies need to move more quickly into clean energy. But also we need equity and adaptation. We need to actually support poor families that are having their livelihoods undermined and help them to have more coping mechanisms, better seeds to grow in drought or flooded land, whatever, and also access to clean energy. And so therefore we need equity in transfer of the technology about clean energy to poor countries. But if we don't do that, they have a right to develop, even if it's, in quotes, dirty development. And they are not the ones responsible, we are, for that decision, if you like. I mean, because they have a right to development. So thank you for the question. Sorry for taking a bit long to answer, but yeah.
Maybe one last question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Carly. I am a sophomore here at Mount Holyoke College, and I'm a double major in environmental studies and environmental engineering. And thank you for being here today. My question relates to sort of the media coverage of this issue in large countries like the United States. You had touched on the issue a little bit of how we have not demanded from our legislators that there is justice and more regulation to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And I was wondering how in a country where we do have the money for air conditioning and heating and to transport food and goods a long distance, how do we demand from our legislators and from our fellow citizens justice on this issue?
Well, I absolutely agree with you. There needs to be so much more real discussion. And I don't think we're going to get good discussion about climate change until we talk about people and how it's affecting them. And it's affecting them in this country as well. Those families that had their homes destroyed by Sandy and know now what the struggle is to try and remake their lives. And there have been far more extreme weather events in this country than there have ever been in previous decades. And so it's happening. And once you get a sense that it's happening here, you'll recognize that in poorer countries that are more vulnerable, it's happening earlier and worse. And then you get a kind of urgency about needing to do something about it. In order to ensure that there is a faster move from fossil fuel to clean energies, you have to somehow tax carbon. Or have some kind of carbon charge. And then industry will respond to that. It's the way to do it. We have a carbon tax in Ireland. There's a carbon tax in Australia. Countries are moving in that direction. This country needs to move in that direction. You actually should be, and since in a way you're asking the last question because we've run out of time, can I just say, as you introduced yourself and said what you were studying, I'm thinking to myself, you actually know a lot more about the environment probably than I do, because I didn't study it as much. But it's great to be in a position at my stage as an elder, as a grandmother, to be learning. And that is one of the things I like about the link between human rights development and climate change and the whole climate justice approach. I'm learning, and I'm learning essential issues that bring a framework for what we need to do. The framework of needing a climate agreement by 2015, as governments have promised, and that must come into effect by 2020, and what we do in the post-2015 development period to have more sustainable development goals. And you can't have sustainable development goals unless we put a brake on the carbon using that we're doing, which is destroying our world. So I'm very pleased that so many of you in Holyoke are looking at issues of environment, development, finance. We've been hearing all of these issues talked about because they are the issues. And this is probably the most pivotal time in recent human history. We have the time between now and the end of 2015 to take two big steps, a fair, ambitious climate agreement and a good post-2015 regime, both for poor countries that still haven't reached the Millennium Development Goals in full, and sustainable development goals for all countries, which is what has been promised. And if we don't do that, we could be responsible for a future injustice that I don't think any of us even want to think about, and I certainly don't want to think about the way in which those who are our grandchildren and their grandchildren will look back at this time and say, how could they have been so selfish? So it's young people and your perspective that's going to change the debate, but it has to be about people, and I believe it has to be a climate justice approach. Climate justice now in our world, climate justice for future generations. And, do it. Thank you.